What is the job that marketing should get done in a company?
I have several answers for this, so I'm going to pick the one that I think is the best answer. And I think when I was trying to think of something really profound to answer this with, and I think what it really boils down to for me is that marketing is all about communication. What I mean by that is like ultimately it's all about leading up to selling a product of some sort. And for me, anywhere along that journey from the initial awareness through to the final sale is kind of communicating something. And I suppose for me, like that what that communication is probably changes as you go down that sort of funnel. But I think there's always some idea being communicated at each point. And I think marketing's job is really to communicate that idea in the clearest possible way so that it resonates with people.
That's Joe Daniels, a former head of content and creative turned founder of Left Field, where he helps B2B companies escape category conformity with POV-led positioning and messaging. Joe's an incredibly smart man, and I was grateful to hear his contrarian takes on this episode. Before we get back to our conversation, run the intro. Welcome to On Marketing, a show where we explore what marketing is, with the goal of improving how you think about marketing and life, not telling you what to think. It's October 31st, 2024. I'm Jordan Ogren, a marketing strategist by day and a podcast host by night. All opinions shared in this podcast are the individual views of the hosts and guests, not those of their employers or associate organizations. This content is intended for informational purposes and should not be considered professional marketing or life guidance. Listeners act on the information provided at their own risk. Thank you again for being here. If you had to pick, or if you had to kind of put one being more important, is it the what of the message, the how of the message, the when of the message? Not really sure like if why of the message would fit, but like as you're thinking about that, which of those floats to the top for you that's really most important?
I think obviously they're all interconnected, but I think the what is always really the key. And maybe I'm biased because that tends to lean towards the work I do, is figuring out what that what is. But I think if you're not clear on the what, it gets really hard to be clear on the other things, because it's like, well, I don't know what I'm saying in the first place, right? I think you could probably get the timing slightly wrong. You could probably say it to slightly the wrong person. But if what you're saying is right, then I think it will find its way to the right people at the right time anyway.
Which I find interesting from the bit that I look online of marketing advice or tips and tactics, especially social media. It's hugely around like the when to post, or and for me that's always just seemed like really bad advice before thinking about like what are we actually sharing the story, is it well positioned? What are your thoughts on that?
I completely agree, and I know why, and the why is that like if you said, oh, what's some advice for growing on LinkedIn, it would be way easier for me to go, oh, you know what? Just post at 11 a.m. every day. There you go. Sorted. Cool. Like, it's a really easy, tangible thing. Even if it's completely incorrect, it's a really easy thing to say. And I think it's much harder to go, oh, well, you know, the reason you're not gaining any traction on LinkedIn is because you don't actually have anything interesting to say. Suddenly becomes a much tougher conversation to have with someone, right? It's like, oh, well, that's it's pretty awful. So I think it's harder, because it's harder to define the what and get that right. People just focus on the easier parts, right? The path of least resistance, and go, oh, it's probably because I'm not posting at the right time, or it's because I've not got the right audience, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, I'm sure they maybe have an impact, but I think it's probably like 5% impact versus the 95% of what are you saying?
When you're thinking about the what, it starts to be, in my mind, almost this Russian doll-esque of like, there's so many different whats that I could talk about our product features. I could talk about the amount of money we raised as a startup. Like, how do you start to drill down in like the whats? And I know where you're going to take this just because I know your work and kind of this story, your point of view, but how do you think of the different whats that you could even share, or the different things that you could communicate?
I mean, the Russian doll analogy is quite nice actually here, in that I think, and it goes back to what you said about, you know, the who and the timing is also important. And I think if you do see it as that Russian doll and you see those different layers, it takes time to get to the central doll in the middle, right? I think that's what a Russian doll is. Like, that's actually when we're talking about the same thing, like where it's the little nest of and to get to the one in the middle, you have to go through the other layers, right? And I think if you just showed me the middle one and went, oh, look at this Russian doll, I'd be like, that's not a Russian doll, that's just a little doll. Do you know what I mean? Like there's no like, what's the rest of it? But if I've gone on that journey from the outer layer to the inner layer, then the inner layer means a lot more. And so I think to tie that to, the sort of companies I work with, like a lot of them focus on that inner layer, the central layer straight away. And they go, look at our product, look at what it does, look how great it is, blah, blah, blah. But it's lacking all the context of the outer layers to really make that inner layer important. And I think if you widen it out and say, well, actually, what's the first layer? What's the next layer? And so on. It almost, for me, it should start with the kind of more brand related stuff. So like, what's our point of view? What's our perspective on the category that we're in? What's, the sort of stuff I do. And then once you've kind of hooked them in with that, they peel away a layer and they go, okay, well, what's underneath it? Oh, now you're talking about some use cases and capabilities and stuff. That's interesting because I know what's come before, and so on until you kind of dig right down into the core of like, oh, here's the pricing and the sales process and so on and so forth. And so I think it's a good analogy that I'm definitely going to steal for myself.
As you were talking, I couldn't help but think on how at least the stories I read, the books I read, have that type of building up in the sense of that it paints this larger picture, if it's maybe talking about changes going on in the world, or because it never do I open it and instantly it's like 5 ways to do better X, because it's just like I don't really know where you're coming from, what is the enemy, the hero. So could you get maybe into some of those? I recently read your book and you talk very in depth about the hero and all of these pieces of story or a point of view or a strategic narrative. Could you just define those for the listener?
One thing that I think I always say is really important to define and is really the who, and this goes back to the what versus who sort of argument we had before, but like the who is basically the hero of this story that you're trying to tell, and it's not you as a company, right? Because no one cares about your company realistically. No one cares about your product or your company or you as a founder realistically. No one cares. They care about themselves. We're all selfish. And I think if you create the story around me as a potential customer, well, then I can see myself in it and I go, oh yeah, okay, that sounds like the situation I'm in. So the key thing firstly is to figure out who that person is. And sometimes that's the hardest thing because companies want to appeal to everyone and in doing so appeal to no one. So really getting that who and that hero of your story right is kind of the first step, because actually that informs a lot of the rest of what you're going to say. Once you've done that, you then kind of need to define, I have quite sort of like random terms that I've used to describe all of this stuff, but I'll just put it almost in plain English instead for listeners. But like essentially you've got your hero. Then you've got essentially what is sort of a shift that's happening in their world, like, and in your world as the category as well. It's kind of like something is happening that is going to impact you as the hero of this story in a negative way. This is kind of that in an actual story, this is like the call to action bit, like, oh, the princess has been kidnapped, right? Mario, you need to come and save the prince. That's what's happened that triggers the rest of the story, right? And again, it can be quite hard because it's easy to go very generic and broad and say something like, oh, AI is here. It's like, yeah, it is. but what's more interesting about that is a specific thing that comes out of that. So if it was like, oh, AI is here and it means that there's way too much cold outreach going on. Okay, well, that's a bit more specific. And then you can tie that to how your product deals with that, right? So it pays to be specific in a way that it's like, the way I describe it is a shift that's happening in your world as a company that impacts my world as a customer. Do you know what I mean? Like it's finding that duality of impact. What that does is it provides all the context, like you said. It means something now. It's like, okay, now I understand the context. Then you sort of introduce the big problem, the big enemy of the story, which is, I like to do it. My approach is often differentiation in a crowded market, and what that often means is to you have to push away from the other solutions in that market. So what I always try to do is make the enemy something like some kind of weakness or limitation of the existing solutions. And then it ultimately says, look, these are all bad because of this reason. You don't. I would advise maybe in most cases not to call competitors out by name and go like, oh yeah, this product, don't use that. But instead focus on something they do badly and use that, fight the concepts rather than them. That's your enemy, right? That's the big enemy of the story. And again, a lot of companies don't do this bit because, and I hear this all the time, is that we don't want to be negative though. We don't want to be, and it's like, without that negativity, without that conflict, you don't actually have a story or a narrative, right? Because imagine, I don't know, going to the cinema and like you sit down with your popcorn and it's like, oh, it was all nice all the way through. Oh, well, okay. Like without that conflict, there's no tension. Without that tension, there's no relief at the end. It's all pointless, right? It's just facts rather than a narrative. Really lean into that negative, really sort of like, it should almost be the pivot point of the whole story should rest around this problem. Because if you can own that problem, you then kind of become the de facto solution to that problem, and people will associate you with that problem when they get it. So you've got the problem, then you introduce the solution, and essentially it's almost like the magic wand that you're giving to the hero so that they can overcome the bad guy. And for me, I think this is equally important in that a mistake I see is a lot of storytelling and narrative almost ends up too fluffy. It almost becomes like let's tell a nice fairy tale sort of story, but it never links it back to the product. And I think the linking to the product is actually the really important part, because yes, it's all well and good having the context, setting the scene, here's the bad guy. But if you don't explain how your product helps them defeat that bad guy, well then they're not going to see that there's a solution. They're just going to be depressed and be like, oh well, I've got this problem. What do I do? So you have to kind of then be like, okay, well look, this is really bad. This is a really bad problem. Luckily for you, we're your sidekick. We're here, and we're going to help you solve that problem with our product. And that's when you can get a bit more tangible and talk about capabilities, functionality, and features, and so on. Because at that point you've earned it, right? You've instead of just going straight into that final chapter of the story, you've shown the full journey, and the people have gone along with it. And so when you finally tell them about the product, they're like, oh, I instantly see the context now. I understand why this exists. I understand why I need it, and it changes. Even if you're communicating the product in exactly the same way, adding that context beforehand suddenly changes the meaning. It becomes more impactful.
That's good stuff, Joe. That was a masterclass. It was like essentially the book, but over 5 minutes. That's great. I appreciate that. A few things, and maybe you can kind of cherry pick which of them you want to go deeper on. But I love that last piece, the bridge being maybe one of the harder things. And I think, at least for me, it came up of that sometimes we think it's a marketing problem, but usually it's actually marketability, that we create this story almost after the product was. So then we're trying to bridge to a place that, like, at least sometimes I can feel it of like, there's other solutions. They're like, why is yours the only one? Or it just doesn't, like, the connection isn't made, which then makes me think, to your first point, it really has to all begin with the who. And the more you get specific with that ingredient, then the rest of your entire cake turns way more specific. Almost like they found my journal as a product manager, whatever that's specific. And they're just writing it out, all my fears and all my. So how do you think about that of, like, sometimes we're trying to fit a story around a product that isn't actually doing its well, or like if we actually understood the audience, we would have a different product, or the story would like naturally have the bridge. What are your thoughts on those two?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting that, like, if you were like, Joe, here's a load of money, go and build some sort of SaaS product, right? I would personally start by figuring the narrative out and the point of view and stuff first, and I'd be like, oh, I know a lot about marketing, say. I'm going to make I vaguely know I'm going to make a tool in that space. I really, I could be like, oh, I really love talking to solopreneurs, right? So it's like, oh, let's make a tool for them. Then I'd start with them and I'd talk to them. as much as I could and learn, well, what kind of problems do you have? Why can't you currently solve them? That why you can't solve them now, that's the gold mine. It's like, it's all well and good being like, oh, I just have trouble managing all my contacts. It's like, okay, well, but why? Because there's tools developed to help you do that already. So why aren't you using those? What do they not do? And that's when you start to hear the limitations of existing solutions. And then I would go, okay, well, I'll build something that overcomes those limitations. And so I'd almost start with the point of view and then build the product in line with it. But that doesn't always happen, right? And so sometimes what happens is they go, here's the product. And I'm not saying it's their fault. Like, I can see why that happens, and over time, you get a lot of, you get some seed funding or whatever. You're like, oh, let's got to actually build this. You get building, it spirals into things that you didn't think it was going to be. You get swayed by different factors. I get it. It's really hard. It's easy for me to go, hypothetically, you just do this, but it's hard. And I think what ends up happening is everything in terms of the context and the point of view and the narrative is basically pushed aside. And it's like, oh, we'll save that for when we've got our product market fit and so on. It's like, okay, cool. It means that it's harder to retrofit the narrative and point of view to the product. It's possible, but it's harder because suddenly it's like, well, hold on, now if we're starting at the end of the story, we need to almost work backwards and figure out, well, okay, why, if that's the end, how did we get to that bit? And it would be like if maybe she did, it'd be like if J.K. Rowling wrote the ending of Harry Potter first, and I was like, oh, right, okay, how do we get to that bit? And maybe she did that, but yeah, it's hard. It's harder. It's also most cases what has to happen, and I think, yeah, in an ideal world, you'd do the point of view and narrative first, and use that to inform the product roadmap. What I'd say is if you've already got the product and you need to retrofit the narrative, that's fine. But then what I'd say is have an eye on the future too. Because I think the mistake a lot of people make is they think, this is our product now. What's the story around what our product currently is? But actually that's quite limiting. It doesn't have to be that way. What you could do is you could go, what do we think the category will look like tomorrow, and how can we build the products that suits tomorrow and build the narrative that suits tomorrow, and almost have one foot forward, because that's how you differentiate, is ultimately by leading the way, literally by going, actually, this is wrong, this is the right way. And it's why I tell people I work with, like, your product might change or have to change as a result of this. It might be that you go, even our product is limited. We need to change it to adapt it to the narrative and point of view. And I think if you're willing to do that and sort of see them as like a two sides of the same coin, then I think that's the gold standard.
Something that comes to my mind as like a potential reason for that is that we usually think of marketing as a thing you bolt on to it at the end. And as you talk about it, it makes so much sense then, because to me, the marketer is the storyteller. As Seth Godin wrote, all marketers are liars or storytellers. Like, that is the job of marketing, because in the word marketing is market, which is really the story. It's involving a market of people within a larger market of the world in like marketing. So then when I think of, and I want you to give an example, because I can only imagine as a listener, I read your book, but as a listener, they're like, okay, Joe, this is all great in theory, but I think Jason Fried and the team over at Basecamp have done this really well with their other products, Hey being one that I'm a paying subscriber to. But can you talk through the once example in the story they share, and maybe not so deep, but just to a point at which the listener could at least put into action maybe some of these things we've been talking about?
I mean, I think once is a good example in that, I have no insider knowledge of the Basecamp team, 37 Signals, but like, I can only assume they came up with the point of their perspective first and then solved it with the product. And I guess for people who don't know, what they've done is they've said their whole narrative essentially is, you know what, actually, the subscription model doesn't always work. It's actually not ideal. Like, they're like, basically, do you remember the good old days when you could kind of just buy software off the shelf and actually own it? And they're like, in some cases, for our type of people, this is actually a much better approach. And so they essentially I don't know if it's still the case, but when they first launched, their website was essentially like a manifesto that outlined this narrative. It wasn't flashy. It didn't even really show the product, right? It was like literally just like a few paragraphs of the founder being like, look, here's what we think. Subscription models for SaaS are kind of broken a bit. They're not good for you as a customer for various reasons that they list out. So what we've done is we've created and this is the interesting part, essentially the same product as Slack, except it's not a subscription model. You buy it once, you own it. I think you own the code and stuff as well. So like if you are technically minded, then you can change the code and adapt it if you wanted to. You look after it yourself, you host it yourself. It gives you a lot more control. From a functionality point of view, it does the same thing as Slack with so they've got a series of products. I think the first one is Campfire. It's essentially a messaging tool for teams to keep in touch with each other, similar to how Slack's used. From a use case and functionality point of view, it's the same, but from a point of view and narrative perspective, like it's not the same, because you've got the context before it of, like if I think basically what I'm saying is if they just launched and went, you know what, we've made this Slack clone, but you just pay for it once, it would be interesting, right? Like people would be like, oh, okay, we just pay for it once, cool. So the pricing thing is a differentiator, cool, like I get it. But by sharing the narrative an insight that led to that product development and the idea of it being a one-time payment, so you're like, oh, you're right, that makes perfect sense. And I think they did a great job at communicating the context, right, behind the decision to build the product that way. I think that's the why. You mentioned the missing why piece before, the communication, and I think the why did you build this product in this way is a really interesting question to ask yourself when it comes to this kind of stuff. Is like, why did we make these decisions? Because actually the answer to that's kind of that North Star brand strategy piece that you might have never really defined, but as a sort of cheat hacky way to maybe start thinking about it, it's why is this our product? Why did we build it this way? Why did we use this framework? Why did we add these features? Why did we target these people? And ultimately, if you can answer those questions, that the answers should all converge into that kind of narrative and perspective, and then you can then retrofit it and go, okay, this is our narrative, cool, and then you can start communicating it, because prospects aren't going to join those dots for themselves, so you have to sort of do the work for them.
I love that last piece of the consumer, not maybe, because that for me, Hey, the reason I was so Hey is their email service, you pay $99 a year. The aha for me was like, wait, I don't pay for email services, but I do pay with something else. And that was this narrative. And then the whole product essentially is built the way where you have a screener. So nothing gets to my inbox unless I say it can get to my inbox, which is kind of this problem of like, if you buy Google, or they're going to put so much spam, and then you have these different. So for me, it makes like the optimal way always seemingly for me is like you have the story, because then all the product features, the service, deliver, everything is essentially enhancing or refining the story that we think email is not like right now. So we're going to make it in a way. So you're going to pay, you're going to have this, but there's a reason for it, and it's all baked in the story. So I really like that.
A question that gets asked a lot, and it's a big debate at the moment, at least in my echo chamber, is like, do you differentiate on brand or do you differentiate on product? And what I find really interesting is that the ideal is both, right? Like you should have a very different and distinctive brand that leads into here's our product differentiation, and for me the narrative and point of view is what ties those two things together and makes sense of both. But what's interesting is like in a very crowded market, a lot of people will go, and I have this opinion too, differentiation on product is really hard, right? Like if there's, if you're talking, CRMs, it's like, well, there's too many CRMs realistically, right? Like we don't need that many in the world. There's like realistically, supply and demand dictates with SaaS that you only need one. Like it literally scales to the world. So there's too many. They all, for at a surface level, as far as prospects are concerned, do the same thing. They solve the same problem. And so for me, if if I owned one of these tools and I wasn't differentiated, instead of just going, oh, how do we make our products different? That's kind of a scattergun approach to this. It's like, that's the wrong question. It's why does it need to be different? And so actually, if you take the step back and you figure out on a brand level, what's our narrative, what's our point of view, answering those questions now then gives you a route to that product differentiation. It's almost like, don't start by differentiating your product, start by figuring out your brand stuff and use that to inform the product differentiation. And I think people ask the wrong questions when it comes to differentiating by products. I think if you asked a load of other Slack clones, how are we going to differentiate our products? I don't think they'd have got to, let's do a pay once thing instead of a subscription. I don't think they would have got there. But with Campfire, by going, well, actually, what are some of the reasons we exist? What are we trying to do here? Why do we need to be different? What's the problem with the current tools? Oh, well, everyone's having to pay this monthly fee. It spirals out of control when you've got like thousands of users. People are spending an absolute fortune on it. They have no control over it, and it's the bedrock of their team. Suddenly it's like, oh, well, that's quite an interesting perspective, and it would lead to, oh, well, you know what we could do? We could just have a charge once model. And so then the product differentiation comes from exploring the point of view and narrative. And I think if you see it in that perspective, that's why I think it's important to nail the brand side first and let that inform the product.
That was beautiful. I will not add anything else because I wanted to end at that point. Are you ready, Joe, to go into life now? Get a little deep.
Oh, maybe? Yeah. I mean, this is my life, so I've already answered.
We've been talking about it for the last 20 minutes. Oh, I love it. When you think about life in general, whether it's purpose, goal, or aim, what to you is the reason we're here? What is the purpose of life as humans?
I am torn between two answers here, so I'm going to kind of just run both by you and see which appeals the most. My initial answer when you asked this ahead of time, when I was preparing something, was to the purpose of life is just enjoy it. That was my first response. I was like, you know what? That's the kind of selfish, hedonistic part of me, is like to have fun, to enjoy it, right? Whatever that looks like. As long as you're not, impeding on other people's fun and stuff like that, fine. But how can I maximize the amount of enjoyment that I get from life? And I think when I make life decisions or even small decisions, I'm probably thinking like that. I'm probably kind of like, well, you know what? That chocolate bar is probably not the best thing for me, but I'm going to enjoy it. So I'll do it, right? I'm not saying, obviously it comes with limitations. Like, there are downsides to that. It's like, oh, that's my 5th chocolate bar in an hour. Like, at that point, like, it's a problem. But I think, moderation's key. And I'm not saying everyone listening should just go out and do whatever they want. But but to a certain extent, I think you should just enjoy it, right? Like, I think it's, why would you not want to enjoy it? That's my first answer. My second answer is the more personal development answer. If this was a job interview, this would be my actual answer. And it's, I think it's to try and become the best possible version of yourself that you can be. And I think that's not comparative to anyone else. It's literally internal to you. It's like, are you... And better is also subjective. That could mean different things to different people. And maybe that's how I can encompass my other answer in this, which is like, if better for you means I have more fun, then great, that's your rate. And I think it's up to you to kind of figure out, well, what's the ideal person that I believe a person should be? Is it all to do with kindness and generosity? Is it all to do with having fun and being hedonistic? Is it to do with becoming the best in your field or something like that? We kind of like whatever. I think different people have a different answer to that, but I think the key is that there's no wrong answer to that. Is like, well, what do you value the most out of those kind of big things? And then the purpose is go for it. Do you know what I mean? It's almost like if you value more than anything being a great person in terms of like, I'm kind to everyone, I do favors for friends all the time, I volunteer, like try and maximize that part of your life and improve on that, you know. So it's like you can always be a kinder person, you can always be a more generous person, you can always be a more fun person. What can you do each day to kind of take those incremental steps towards being as much of that thing as you can be?
Yeah, there's a lot of contrast between those two answers. I'm kind of confused because they're two almost like both spectrums of like, you know, life's supposed to be hard, but we should enjoy it because we're getting better, but we need to enjoy it. So how do you then, maybe just from this dichotomy of external, internal, because the first one for me seems to be quite internal. Any sort of pleasure, joy, happiness is somewhat derived internally within me. But then the betterment of self, you would argue, also is somewhat internal. But I personally kind of have more of an external focus. Why do I need to be the best me? As the term hero would describe it, so I can have strength for two. So I can be there in a gap for some. That's my own definition. How do you rationalize this internal, external thought process where maybe we should only be focused on self? Because then if we're happy, that will radiate outwards. Or should we try to make others happy and then we become happy through that?
I think when you've just said that, what I've kind of done is now sort of piece both of those answers together in my head, which is that like, so you see, it does all make sense. So I think this is like therapy. I think I get the most joy and fulfillment by having fun, not just myself, but with people around me as well, because I think it's like you know, I like to make people laugh, for example. That's a thing that I do a lot. I probably joke too much, but actually I think that's because when people are laughing and they're having fun, that fulfills me. And so if I can bring that into the world in some way, well, then I think that's a fulfilling thing for me to do. And that's kind of, it's not my purpose to be a joker. That would be, otherwise I should be a comedian, right? Like I'm in the wrong profession. But like, but like, I think the way I would rationalize both of those answers together is to say, for me, having fun is one of the most important things. So my purpose is how can I maximize fun in my life? But for you, it might not be. Is the point, right? I think my first answer was, what do I value the most? The second answer, I suppose, was more how should, in inverted commas, people live their life? And I think it's find your version of my thing, which is fun, and go all in on it. Do you know what I mean? It's almost like, actually, so for you, like you said, it might be that strength of two thing. That might be your thing. Well, then maximize and live your life in a way that allows you to do that, right? And I think there you go. That's how I can reconcile both answers together in a way that kind of makes sense.
One last question. What do you hope, maybe it's gone slightly in the past few years, but what do you hope we have in 20, 30, 40 years still that we're still clinging to?
Yeah, Joe, this is going to be really nice because this is going to come full circle back to my first answer about communication. I think I at least noticed that during the pandemic and carrying on post-pandemic, there was this need to connect with people again, right? And I felt in the run-up to the pandemic, it was maybe drifting away. It wasn't like, you know, people were like, oh, I'll just message you on Facebook or something and that's enough. And I think because of the pandemic, it really hit home how much we're social creatures at the end of the day. And we're designed to socialize with each other. We're like hardwired to do that. And I think we remembered that as a species. Like, oh, what's nice is talking to people and connecting with people and like building communities, right? That's pretty cool. And when it was taken away, it was like, oh well, we miss it now. It's gone. And I think if there's one good thing to come out of the pandemic, it was this reconnection of, we should get together more and do things more in person and like communicate more and better. And I think that's something that I hope will stay as an after sort of effect of the pandemic. I think it will. I think you mentioned AI will probably almost reinforce that need for human connection because we're going to spend all the rest of our days talking to robots. So we'll definitely need it. In
person and virtual, because I think like during COVID, virtual became big, but something I felt after was like that in the room. And obviously you and me and Joe are not in the same room, but there's something unique about kind of going out. And your point, community can be built virtually, but there's also that physical. Yeah. So yeah, I hope, and that's been a common theme that a lot of people like. I hope we don't go completely social, like on social media, and don't have real friends in life. Like that's been a common trope. So I also hope that we can keep these friendships, these relationships, having communication. Because to the point of how you open, that is what marketing is. And I think a lot of life revolves around communicating.
I mean, not to get all deep and philosophical. I mean, we already have gone deep and philosophical, but when you think about it, it's pretty incredible that we're having this conversation, right? Like that is insane. Like realistically, without technology, we would never have even known of each other's existence, other than there's just some American over there. I don't know. Like we don't deal with those. Like we don't like it's this. When you take a step back and you realize what you're doing, you're like, oh, this is absolutely mind-blowingly insane, and 50 years ago would have been revolutionary. And I think sometimes kind of stopping to realize how lucky we are to have that. And yes, there's downsides, but I think what's interesting is we just invent different ways of connecting with each other. Ultimately, all of these new innovations with the internet and so on, whatever innovations I've just said, the AI even, is really all about how do we communicate and connect with people more or better or faster. And I think that is a consistent part of humanity that I don't think will go anywhere.
Well, Joe, I'm incredibly... Yeah, that was great. Well, I wanted to end by saying I'm incredibly lucky to have met you and to have this conversation, and the 4 or 5 listeners are also quite lucky to have heard your wisdom. So I appreciate you coming on the pod and sharing both marketing and some great life wisdom. So I appreciate you for going there.
Thank you for having me.
And this is the end of the podcast. What one idea or topic of conversation stood out to you today? Write it down, share it with a friend, post it on social. The main thing is take action. That's how we go from theory to mastery. We need to practice. We need to put it into practice. Thank you for listening and being here, and I hope you tune in next week.